No problem. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody. I'm Jennifer Piarkey. I work for the Association of Food Drug Officials. If you're not familiar with the association, we represent the state and local regulators in human food with some expanses in some other directions, but predominantly that. I have the great pleasure of introducing today Jennifer Douglas. She is a certified change management practitioner. She is our change practitioner on a project we're working on called Safer, which is an IT platform. And she's going to be walking you through change management. She is an optimist, as she's self-described, dedicated to utilizing organizational change management methodologies to help solve complex challenges and implement transformational initiatives. She's served in many roles, including Chief Information Officer, Chief Innovation and Strategy Officer, and Customer Officer roles in private, non-public, and public sectors, both in state and local government. So she knows where many of you are coming from and where you're sitting right now. She originally was born in Vermont, has a bachelor's degree in liberal arts from Northern University of Vermont, followed by an MBA, Master's of Business from Babson College, and another Master's in Data Warehousing and Analytics from Villanova University. She is currently pursuing her PhD through Colorado State University with a focus on organizational learning, performance, and change. And her dissertation is centered on understanding how remote workers gain a sense of belonging in an organization. And when she's not working, you can find Jennifer gardening, sewing, or cooking in her kitchen. So without further ado, I introduce Jennifer Douglas to you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. That was terrific. Yeah, I'm not gardening right now because I live in Boulder, Colorado. So there is no gardening happening right now. But anyways, today we're here for change, and I'm really excited. As Jenny said, change has been part of my life and background, and still the work that I do today. In many ways. And so I'm excited to be able to go through the fundamentals of change management. There's actually more than one class, as you can imagine, but we're going to start here. So let me see why my slide will now not progress. There we go. So I think that you've probably heard enough about me. Again, I live in Boulder, Colorado. I am originally from Vermont. So if you're from the Northeast, I've been watching the weather. I still watch the weather there. We've been living in Colorado for about 9 years. And I always miss the Northeast because it's so green and beautiful until January comes around. And then I say, oh my God, look how cold and snowy it is there. So yeah, if you're from the Northeast, you just got hit with that big snowstorm. So I've been thinking about you guys. So today what we're going to cover is really change management, definitions, the basics. And of course, my picture is right in the way here. Change concepts. Why does change fail? What are the success factors? Some of the analysis and tools and strategy for implementation, and then what's next. I think what I want to make sure that you understand is there's a lot of different change models, and we're going to be talking about some of the models today. There's probably about 40. I selected the top models. And as we go through the models, I'll tell you why it's important to understand that there's more than one model for change out there. So really today is just to get you familiar. And at the end of the session, I'm going to give you some more information if you want to learn more. We have 2 other sessions that will probably be running at some point this year. And what it does is it takes the model and extrapolates that model, and it shows you how to implement that. So we'll talk about that as we go. So I first want to start out with the definition of change management, because I think, you know, as Jenny said, I've been in the IT space for a really long time, and there's more than one type of change that we talk about. If you've ever been in an ITIL class, change management for a lot of technical people is the change process that happens, right? It's not change management, organizational change management. So I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what organizational change management is and why that's very different. And so change management is really the implementation, control, and the stabilization of a company's change process. And so if you think about this, It could be anything. So let's say that you're having organizational change. That would fall under organizational change management. So how people are impacted by the change that's happening. So it's not necessarily a technical change process, but it's really impacting people. So the efficiency of change process is becoming widely accepted. I think what I've seen as a change management practitioner is since the pandemic, change management in really the foundation of change management has been really recognized as being a critical component of having employee dexterity. How easily can employees move from one way of working to another way? I mean, what a great demonstration through the pandemic of how flexible some organizations are versus some others. So even in Colorado, I can look at some of the ways that like the hospitality industry has managed through this change. And some of them will still be viable after the pandemic and some will not. And a lot of that has to do with how quickly they could adapt. And so that's really the definition of this. So the one thing that we know, and we've known it for thousands of years, is the only thing is constant is change, right? Everything is always changing in our life. And I think what's interesting is in our personal lives, we tend to accept change a lot easier. So for example, the new iPhone comes out, right? That's a huge change for a lot of people, and they're excited by that change. But when it comes to work change, we're less excited because that's where we have the process. We say, well, I already know how to do this one thing. Why are you trying to change it? And so typically, even people that love a lot of change in their life don't like it when it's at work. And so how can we move people through change so that our organizations can continue to thrive? So what we're going to go through now is really kind of like foundational. What is change management? So what I like to say is it's really the soft side of change. So it's not, I'm changing this widget for this widget. Change, the organizational change is really the soft side of change because it's about people. And so, and that kind of change is the most challenging, right? It's easy to implement a new piece of software because the software is going to work. But what's hard about that is getting people excited about the change and how their job is then going to change, right? And so I like to say that this is the softer side of change because we're really dealing with people and feelings. And it's, again, the most challenging component of any transformation is going to be the people part. And that's the place that we focus the least on. We say, oh, we're going to have a lot of strategy and plans around implementing this new building that we have. But we're not going to think about how people are going to feel about having to drive to the new building and maybe they don't get their same parking spots and so forth. And then the change doesn't go well. So it's really the softer side. In change, you'll probably see this analogy a lot if you looked up I did not make this up. This is kind of lifted from a pretty common analogy, and it's really around changing behavior. And there's three things in change that we have to think about. And they use this analogy of a rider and an elephant. And it's really the three things that we have to be concerned about in change is how do we direct the change? So here it's how do you direct the rider? So the rider knows, which way is he going, right? And so when the rider doesn't understand the direction, they will steer the elephant into circles, right? And that's what looks like resistance to us. It's an employee that says, I don't want to have this. I don't understand why you're doing it. So it looks like they're resisting. And in fact, probably as the change leader or as the manager, you haven't set a good enough direction for them to understand what the change is going to be. And so it looks like they're resisting. The next part of change is really being clear. And I think we have a hard time being clear because we don't want to hurt people's feelings. We kind of have high level PowerPoint presentations that happen and people really don't understand, like, what does that mean? And so people don't understand the need for the change. So what's in it for me? Why do I care that you're going to be changing something? How am I going to get impacted? And again, like this can look like resistance. People are not coming along because they really don't, they don't have clear direction about why. And remember, when we're thinking about people, it's about what's in it for me, right? So if I'm impacted by the change, let's say that you're going to change one of my processes that I have been doing for 20 years. I go to work, I do this process. Why do I want a different process? You have to convince people that the change is better and there's something in it for them in order for them to come along. And you also have to like shape the path. So where are we all going? How do we motivate that elephant, right? How do we shape the path and focus and have them focus on the surrounding environment? And so this is really, again, like, how are we shaping the conversation around why we're making the change? I think as leaders, and I've led a lot of organizations, and sometimes I've done change well and other times not. And I always reflect back on projects that haven't been as successful. In the first place I look is, well, did I give, direction? Was I clear enough? Did I set the path out, or did I just say, I'm going to blaze ahead and, I'm going to have carnage in the way because I need to get this done? Sometimes moving slower means you're moving faster in the end. And so if you read anything about change, you'll probably run into this slide that I have here. I just lifted it again. So organizations, as we know them, are the people in them, right? And if the people don't change, there's no organizational change. This is so pivotal to understand. And so, and I've worked in state government, and I know, I know you all work in state government. I worked for the state of Colorado for the governor, and managed a lot of the IT across the state of Colorado. And I understand that it can be kind of a slow moving process working for state or local government. But really, it's organizations we know are the people in them. And so if people in them do not have dexterity to change, then organizations can't change when they need to. And in order to survive, and even as state government, we have to be better at being able to be flexible and agile in the world that we're in today, right? And so what we need to do then is we need to focus on the people, give them the skills that's required for them to be able to be adaptable and change. So realizing the value. So a lot of people say to me, really, is change that critical? Change management that critical? It really is. In major transformations, one of the things that I worked on for years, and I know as you as leaders probably have as well, is you're focusing on the best strategic and tactical plan. You're getting budget, you're getting people on board. But to succeed, you have to have an understanding of the human side of what that change is going to impact. And so the plans themselves do not capture the value. So you can have whatever plans that you want in place, but if you're not considering the human impact, you're not going to capture the value of that project, whatever the project is. And value is only realized through the collective action of the employees. And so I think, like, in today's world, it's really important. And I have this great story. I was working for the governor's office actually right when the pandemic started, and I was part of this pandemic task force. And one of the things that he said to our IT staff is, we have to have 50% of the employees in the state of Colorado being able to work remote in the next 48 hours. We had not set that up at all. I was completely amazed at how quickly and how agile our host state of Colorado was, the employees were, about working at home. And so I think that's the realized value, right? We've been working to get people more agile. We had done a lot of change management before the pandemic had happened, and it really paid off during that time. So why does change matter? I think I kind of talked about this a little bit here, is that, the data shows that effective change management, it really drives the benefit and realizes the results and outcomes. Early in my career, I worked for a consulting company, and we would implement large systems, and sometimes the systems worked beautifully, and we would get rave reviews from the organization. And we had companies like Ben and Jerry's, Cabot Cheese, really large organizations. And other times we would implement the same exact technology and it was just kind of a so-so experience. And that's when early on in my career that I started realizing that it wasn't about the technology, it was all about the people and how much we encouraged teamwork, engagement, and encourage people to be part of those projects. And that was ultimately the place that we would find a lot of success. So the key concepts here is organizational change happens one person at a time. That sounds daunting, but it's really true. So each person has to accept the change. Poorly managed change is super costly, and effective change management increases the likelihood of success. And so mitigating your mission critical risk, this is what we want to do, right? So if we're putting together a multi-million-dollar plan, or even if it's a $10,000 plan, you want to eliminate the risk. And implementing change management means you're eliminating a large pool of risk because it's about the people. And so change management is going to help drive the adoption. So, being in technology all my life, we've heard of this, shadow IT, and technologists get super frustrated about shadow IT. The only reason why shadow IT happens is because we have not done change well. And so people don't want to move away from the systems that they know and that they love in the processes because we haven't brought them along. So ultimately the project that we're trying to do is not successful because we have people still using the old systems. So some key concepts here. We have some key facts. Only companies with a learning rate higher than their environment rate of change will achieve long-term success. And I'm going to stop there for a minute and think about this. So only companies with a learning rate higher than the environment's rate of change. So what does that really mean? It means that we need to be learning organizations. We need to continue professional development for people. We need to continue encouraging people to learn, because if we do not, then our rate of success and change is going to be very minimal. And so the very first step in change management in an organization is looking at what kind of learning rate that we have as an organization. Do we support professional development? Does everybody have a professional development budget? All of those things. Even if you're doing internal learning, it's really important that people are adapting and continue their learning process. Also, continuous control of change measures ensures flexibility. And so the more that you change little things. So imagine or think about the Apple phone. They have little changes, right? Every time you have to update your phone, which seems like every month for me, there's a little change in there, right? So the more that they do it, the more flexible I am, because I'm accustomed to them changing. So we should be on a continuous change process within an organization, not just like one big bang of change and then that's it. It should be that the more we change, the more comfortable people are with change, even if they're small changes. And so there's also change management causes a targeted momentum that entails continued growth potential. And so what we want to do, again, is always look at our processes. So continuous process improvement falls underneath change management. How do we communicate with people when we're changing processes and looking at those types of things? So advantages. This is just research. And so it's 6 times more likely to achieve project goals if you implement change management. So if you implement one of the models, and it doesn't necessarily matter what model, we're going to talk about the models, but if you implement one of the models, your project has a 6 times more likely, it's 6 times more likely to achieve the project goals. It's 5 times more likely to finish before or on the deadline. And it's 2 times more likely to stay or be under budget. Those are huge. So if you think about a $4 or $5 million transformation, you want that to be successful. So you have you're 6 times more likely to be successful if you're implementing change management. So what are the effects of this and why does this work? Well, employees adopt change more quickly. So if whatever you're changing, if they don't want to adopt the change, that stops your project really dead in the water. Employees are more motivated and more productive and efficient if they feel part of the process. So change management gets employees to be part of the process. If they feel part of the process, they're motivated. If they've given feedback to the process, they're much more productive and they're much more efficient. Now, change management doesn't mean that everybody agrees, because not everybody's going to agree that their desk should be moved from one side of the building to the other. But if you can get them to understand why it's going to be better for them, they could still support the effort. So not all change is that people are excited about it, but we want to at least get people to understand. So employees understand why the change is taking place, and that's really important. If they don't understand, they're going to go out and strike. I mean, I always think about, and I work a lot with unions, and I think about the unions and the strikes and all of that. And a lot of times I feel like, boy, if we just implemented some of these change, people would understand what is being asked of them and not be so resistant to the change. All right, effects. So change management generates positive energy for change. So people get excited about change, just like I'm excited when a new iPhone comes out, because I'm accustomed to having them come out every 2 years. So I look forward to that. It also builds confidence in the employees, in their own strengths, and it allows for learning and development across the organization. Remember when I talked a little bit about a learning organization. So it's really important that that learning stays in there. And it also strengthens the networking through communication, because when you're implementing change management, you're communicating a lot with employees. You want them to be in the know. So you're strengthening your relationships as that's happening, and you're realigning the organization. So if you want to change your value statement, your mission statement, whatever that is, you're realigning the culture of the organization through change. And it promotes a collective thinking process. So it doesn't feel like it's just top down. We know that that style doesn't really work. It involves and includes people all across the organization, which is really important. Okay, so I'm kind of moving my pictures around my screen because I can't see my, so whoops, let me go back. So why is it important to change? So let me give you some statistics on what organizations and companies that were surveyed. And this was through Gartner. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but Gartner did a big survey, and 76% of the companies surveyed believe that leadership does not take the existing culture into account when designing change. So for example, if you're designing, let's say that you were all an in-office workplace, and then the pandemic happened, and now you're all working remote. And in the meantime, the organization or state that you're working for, because I know that Colorado is doing this, they've decided, hey, we don't need as many buildings as we thought that we needed, and we're going to just eliminate half of our buildings, and now people have to work remote. Well, maybe they're not taking into account that the culture is very accustomed to working together and being able to see each other and being able to have that vibe, right? And so what's important is that leadership takes into consideration what the existing culture is so they can address that during their change. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't still change. It just means that they have to address that piece of, we understand that you all liked seeing each other every day, and this is how we're going to bridge that gap, right? So 76% of the companies, 84% believe that a lack of communication plays a primary role in change failure. So I've heard this a lot. People say, well, we sent out an email, we have a newsletter, people should know. People receive communication when they're ready. So if I sent you an email right now and you had a super incredibly busy day, you might open it, look at it for 5 seconds and say, I'm going to get back to that. Maybe you never open it again. That happens every day, right? So you were not ready to hear my communication at that point. So we have to look at how everyone receives communication, what our different ways of communication is. Just because we think people know does not mean that we've communicated with them. And that is really important. And it's called creating awareness. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. 20% of the companies surveyed believe that most change projects fail as a result of people problems. And so not bringing people along, having misunderstandings, misgivings. And so again, this is really important to involve people. 43% of the organizations believe a lack of resources contribute to change failure. I see this every day. When proposals come in, let's say from an organization, I think we're all familiar with Deloitte or Accenture, and they're going to implement something like, big ERP system. The first thing that leaders want to do is cut that $500,000 of change management that they have in there, because they're like, well, we can do that. We communicate with our people. And certainly I think change management can be expensive, but if it contributes to the failure of a project, if you don't have it, what is the expense of doing the project and having it fail? And so I think this has commonly been the place to cut. Change management and training are always the two places that organizations cut first, because they feel like it's soft skills. And in the end, that's what brings adoption in. So I think we have to start changing our perception about the value that change and these soft skills bring to big transformational projects. So what happens when you don't change? And so I think we can all understand and remember some of these organizations, right? Maybe my kids don't, but Toys R Us. So what happened? Well, Toys R Us are not around anymore. I mean, these are huge companies that you think you would go into them every day and think they would never fold, right? So let's look at Toys R Us. So Toys R Us missed the opportunity to develop their own e-commerce presence early on, and they relied specifically on Amazon. They just said, okay, all of our toys can be bought on Amazon, but they didn't have their own platform, which means that they were effectively competing with Amazon and everybody else that was on Amazon. And that was their demise. So when they re-looked at the organizational failure, they looked at the fact that they were not agile enough. They did not change with what the world wanted them to change to, right? Everybody was developing their own platforms, and Toys R Us didn't do that. And now they're no longer around, which is kind of sad, because I used to bring my kids there when they were really little. We could spend a half a day in Toys R Us looking at those toys. And so, you think at that time that these are huge, they could never close. Look at Borders. The other companies cut down on their music and DVD sections. So if you look at Barnes & Noble, they knew that was not happening for them, as physical sales started getting hit by the move to online purchases, right? More digital. So iTunes started happening. Borders didn't adapt, and they kept buying and trying to sell music. And they didn't respond fast enough, and they actually went under because of that. Look at Kodak. I was big into film for a long time, and I actually took like a dark room class, and the company researched people produced a digital camera. So Kodak actually produced a digital camera in the 70s before anybody else did, but they didn't seize on the potential. They were like, nope, we want to stay with film. We don't think that this is the next big thing. So they actually had all the technology, and they did not move forward. And they virtually went out of business or bankrupt. They came back in a different way, but their company is not as large or as powerful as it ever was. And it's because they didn't seize on the opportunity that they had, which is pretty amazing that they had developed digital in the 70s when no one else had actually even thought about it. And the next one is Blockbusters, which I used to love to go in, Friday after work, we would drop into Blockbusters, we'd get our pizza, we'd get our movies. And I remember Netflix when it first came out. And in 2000, Netflix approached Blockbuster with an offer to sell their company to Blockbuster for $50 million. Netflix is billions now, right? And the Blockbuster CEO was like, no, not interested. But then what Netflix did is they went to Best Buy, and they partnered with Best Buy. And I don't know if you remember, but I remember seeing the sleeves for Netflix on the shelves. I was like, what is that? And then I remember having a subscription to Netflix, like you get 2 movies a month or whatever. And then the next thing you know, Blockbuster's out. But it's because they didn't change. They were not agile enough. And there's just hundreds of these examples. But this is just kind of, because everybody knows these organizations, you think about it and you're like, wow. I mean, I came from technology years and years ago, so I'm going to date myself when Novell was around. So if you were a Novell user or if you knew GroupWise, I loved those products. And I never in a day's dream thought that they would ever be anything but WordPerfect out there. I love that product. And then Microsoft came out, and guess what? They gave their stuff for free. And Novell couldn't compete, right? Microsoft loaded everything on computers for free. And it was the best marketing ploy they could do. And Novell was out. Like, people don't even know what Novell is anymore, except for us old timers. So I want to talk about a change initiative that is working, and I think this is really interesting. So on the right hand of my screen, you see that little door thing from a hotel that says "No housekeeping, please," and they give you money. So I don't know if you've been recently. In the last couple of years, I've seen this, that when you go into, like, I'm a Marriott stayer, so, I belong to a lot of the Marriotts, and they started saying on check-in, hey, if you don't need to have your room cleaned, we will give you either points, right, to your Marriott, or we're going to give you, like, so much out of the bar or whatever. So what they did is essentially cut down on their housekeeping staff, but it was motivating. So just think about this. What's in it for me? As a consumer, I was going to get, like, either a free drink or points. And as a business, it was a win-win because they didn't need to have so many housekeepers, right? So this is a soft sell change initiative. You don't have to do it, but it's encouraged and you get something for it. Now, on the left-hand side, I think this one is amazing because you don't really think about this as being a change initiative, but it's huge. And so what they're doing here is that hotels, and they've been doing it for quite a few years now, is saying, hey, look, if you don't, we want to save our planet, right? So that's their whole, we want to save our planet. Now, I don't know if hotels really want to save the planet, but this is how they're moving the change. So we want to save the planet. So if your towel is still clean enough for you, don't throw it on the floor and we won't wash it, right? Really what it does for the company is it reduces their cost. It makes us feel good as consumers because we feel like we're helping to save the planet, right? And so these are 2 change initiatives that you might not have noticed. But change is happening all around us. And it's really the way that it's perceived is how accepted it is. So when I go to something like the Marriott and I have a choice of not having somebody come in my room and I'm going to get something for it, that's going to be much easier for me to accept that change. And so think about that when you're trying to change employees, a process, or if you're trying to change something at home, because change is everything in our life. So let's say that you've decided that you want to move, you and your spouse want to move, and you have to change the kids' school. Nobody wants to change schools, right? So how do you get them to want to change the school? So what's in it for them? So just think about that. All right. So this is, I think, Jack Welch, who I loved. A lot of people didn't, but I thought he was a really interesting character. And he said something that, kind of caught my attention years ago, is change before you have to. So think about Blockbuster. They should have changed before they needed to. They should have been ahead of the curve, right? So change before you have to, because if you're in the middle of it and you have to, it's really hard to make those transformational changes as an organization. So change before the time comes that you need to. Really important. So I'm going to take a second and then see if there's anybody that has a question. You can put it in the question box. Just go ahead and type it in there. And I'll keep my eye on that. I don't see that there's any questions now, but please feel free to just kind of type in any questions that you have, because I'm happy to answer those for you. So change management models. I talked a little bit about this at the beginning, and there is a lot of models. There is about 40 different change models, And so I'm going to walk us through a few of the change models. And then we have a session on a couple of the different models to really kind of look in depth at those. Why is it important to understand that there's different models? If you hire a consulting company to come in and do any kind of change management or any kind of software deployment, any kind of technology change, they're going to be offering change management. And it's important for you to understand what model that they're using, because what you want to do is you also want to be able to mimic that model organizationally. Now, in the end, they all do the same thing, but the way they go about the models is different. And so today we're going to be talking about Lewin's model, which Lewin is like the grandfather of change management. He actually created the theory of change in the late 40s. We'll be talking about the Addi model. If you've ever done any training, you've probably heard the Addi model because it's really more of a training model. There's the Iceberg model that I think when you see the picture, you'll be really familiar with. A Bridger's transition model, Kubler-Ross change curve. This is when people go through grief. So that was one of the early change models. There's Betcard's model. There's Cotter's theory. There's Procy AdCar model, which is the most common model. Cotter and Prosci are the most common model in the market. So I'll be talking about those more. And then there's the Kirkpatrick model. So these are the models that you'll see Accenture, Deloitte, some of the bigger consulting companies, they will actually talk about the model that they're following. And a lot of times they'll tell you why, because it really depends on the situation of change. So the first one I want to just talk a little bit about is the Lewin three-stage model. So again, this is like the simplest form. And I actually love Lewin's model. Again, he was in the late 40s, early 50s, and he was the one that came up with the theory of change. He was a philosopher in the behavioral sciences. And so he really had these like 3 stages. Unfreeze. So whatever you're doing right now, you're going to unfreeze that. You're going to do the change, and then you're going to freeze again, and you're not going to change again until everybody's okay. Fundamentally, that's what this means. And so in the unfreezing, you have to like determine, what do you need to change? Make sure that there's support and you have a plan, that you're communicating the need for change, and that you're addressing any concerns. So in this unfreezing area, this is all of the activities that you do. So this is when you're communicating with all of your employees or your family members, whoever you're going to be doing the change with. This is to make sure that you're getting the support. So ensure that their support means, do you have stakeholder support? Do you have employee support? Do you have change champions out there? So once you determine all that, then you can do the change, right? So now you've made the change. You've moved from one building to the next. And so then you're going to communicate regularly. Like you're going to really be communicating. You're going to be dispelling any of those rumors. And I think that you've probably been in these situations that when you don't know what's going on, people create their own assumptions and their own story, right? And you're going to involve people, your employees in the process. And then the freeze part is you've integrated the change in your culture, and you've developed ways to maintain the change, and you do support and training, and then you celebrate the achievements and you stop, right? And so everybody gets used to it. This is the Lewins, and I think this is the simplest form of change management. And if you just did this, you'd be far ahead of most people. So think about this Lewin stage. And by the way, you're all going to get this PowerPoint slide deck after. We'll email this to you. So you can use this for anything that you want. I have no problems with you sharing it or whatever. So the Addi model, and again, for anybody that's a trainer, you've probably seen the Addi model, is analyze, design, develop, implement, and evaluate. So this is really more in the training spectrum. So a lot of times when people bring change management forward, they'll say, oh, we're following the Addi model. And I guess what I would say to them is that's great for the training portion of change, but what are you doing for the communication portion and so forth? The Addi model is what professors typically use or teachers use, that you first analyze the current situation, and then you do like a performance gap, and then you design what the goals are, and then you develop the solution, then you implement it and you evaluate. So that's the Addi model. That model is really great together with a change management model. I think this one I've seen in lots of different ways, so I wanted to show you this. This is called the Iceberg Model. So what it's really saying is there's a lot underneath the water that you can't see. It's the invisible organizational culture, how we actually handle things. This is so important in an organization that you understand what is the invisible organizational culture, because the only thing that you see in an organization is the very top layer, right? What is the vision? What is the strategy? What is the common goals? What is the structure? What is the procedures? That's all the things that we have in these handbooks, right? When we onboard people, this is what we talk about. We never talk about what is our norms, what is our traditions, what is the unwritten rules. How many unwritten rules do we have, right? People are like, well, I don't even know where that came from. We've just been doing that for years and years. What are the stories, the shared experiences, the feelings, the values? This is like really understanding what's under the iceberg. So in organizational change, what's important is to go beneath the iceberg to say, okay, if I'm going to implement change management, I have to understand what's the unwritten rules, right? Do the staff get to make the decisions? Is that the unwritten rules? What are the stories that they have? Did they have a transformation and change management didn't go well? And so that's their story, that's their history, and that's what they know. What is their common assumptions about change? And so while it's not a model, it's really interesting to understand like what's underneath that iceberg. This is the Bridges transition, and he was also a philosopher. And so this is really kind of more around grief. And if you think about change and death or grief, it's the same, because something stops and something starts again, right? And so in this Bridges transformation, he says that there's 9 phases. There's the status quo. It's what we have today. Something changes, we go into denial, resistance, pleading, skepticism. This is where you're at your bottom with your employees, right? They've gone through all these emotions. And then tolerance, acceptance, agreement, and advocacy. So what he is saying is there's 9 phases to change. I'm not sure I exactly agree with this. Because I don't think people need to go in denial. So if we looked at change management and then we looked at the Bridges transition, I think that we can skip a lot of these. So we can skip denial, resistance, pleading, skepticism, even tolerance. If we move through change the right way, we can go to acceptance, agreement, and advocacy. And so I wanted to show you this to show you what happens with people when you don't move them through change in the right way. They will go through all of this, right? So you've probably all experienced, having a pet get really sick, and then you have to put them down and you go through all of these stages of grief, right? I don't think that change management needs to have the stages of grief the way that Bridges has laid them out here. This is Kubler-Ross. This is another, and this was really early in change management as well. And you've probably seen a lot of this, like denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then commitment. They've associated change management with death and grieving for many, many years. And I think that's starting to change now. Now we're starting to look at change management can be exciting. It doesn't have to be compared to death, but this is one of the models that you will see that organizations talk about is the Kubler-Ross model. The Betcard model, this is fairly similar to the Lewin model. You have current state, transition state, and future state. I love this model as well because this is really simple. So what's the current state? How comfortable are people in the current state? How is it managed? What is the transition state going to look like? How do we have people let go of the old, accept the new? How do we talk about any feelings of loss and depression, any of those areas? In that transition state, you're going to get some of that. And then what's the future, right? And so this is a really simple model that you could follow while implementing change. You don't have to do really complex things. Kirkpatrick, this is, again, pretty similar. Reaction, learning, behavior, results, right? So you're going to get, what's the reaction to this? Where's the learning? How do you change behaviors? and what's the targeted results that you want. Another really kind of easy model to follow. Now, these next two models are the models that I typically follow the most. And one is the Cotter 8-step model. And this really was founded through Harvard. I believe John Cotter was a professor there when he developed this model. And I love this model because it gives you kind of some steps. So the first one is establish urgency. So we have to establish urgency with people like, hey, we have to move to a new building because this building's not fit for us to be in. There's bad air quality or whatever that is. So you're establishing the urgency. Like, we have 90 days to get out. So people are like, oh, okay, I've got to get going, right? And so I love establishing the urgency because it's almost like an action plan. And then the next step is forming a leadership coalition. Like, so do you have a committee? Do you have a group of stakeholders that are involved right from the beginning? Developing the vision. So what is the vision? Why are we doing this? Communicating, empowering employees to participate in the change. And that means the entire company, right? So when we empower employees, we have employees that feel like they're part of the process. They're not having change done to them, they are changing with the organization, which is really important. And then really developing quick wins. And so what are the quick wins and celebrating them? And then stimulating the change and then sustaining the change. This is a really good model. And I have a session that we'll be offering later this year that just shows you every step on this model and how you actually implement this model. But this is one of the more common ones in the industry that big consulting companies are using. The other one that you might have already heard of, and you might have some change management agents in your organization, or maybe you've gone to training, is Procy. So Procy is probably the most common change management methodology that's out. And the reason why I did it last is because I want to show you that, in essence, all change management is kind of the same. They use different wording and they have different phases. So Procy has a 3-step phase. They have prepare, manage, and consolidate. And inside of that, they have a model that's called AdCar. And this is, again, the most popular out there. I'm certified in Procy, and a lot of people are. I know in the state of Colorado, we had about 100 people certified in Procy. And it's about having a common language about how you move through change. So I'm going to stop here for a minute and talk about the Procy model. I have another presentation that, again, we're going to be offering that just does a deep dive into Procy and how you implement this model. And so it's really the how, why, and when. And so the AdCar model is fairly simple. It's the A stands for awareness. How do you give people awareness of something that's going to be happening, right? And some people connect that with communication, and that could be it. But maybe communicating with people is not giving them awareness, right? So maybe sending out that newsletter or email does not equal awareness. Awareness means when you walk up to any employee in the organization that's going to be impacted, and you could say, tell me about the change, and they'd be able to describe it to you. Why? What is the change happening? That's creating awareness. So it has a lot to do with communication, but you also have to test it. And you have to say, okay, I'm going to send out a survey to make sure, hey, does everybody understand that this is going to happen? So that's the first step in the AdCar model, is understanding, hey, do we have an awareness? And you have an awareness campaign is what it's called. So maybe a 30, 60, 90-day campaign that you're communicating, you're sending flyers, you're doing it in video, you're having webinars, those types of things, until you reach saturation and everyone's aware. And then once everyone's aware, you can move to the desired state. And the desired state is the hardest state to get everybody in, but you can't move in the model until you accomplish this. So let me give you an example. My mother-in-law, when she turned, I think it was 86, it became really evident that she shouldn't be driving. She was a danger to herself. She was a danger to others. She had hit her mailbox. She had hit her garage door. And so she knew, she was aware, right, of the problem, but she had no desire to give up her license. No one does. I mean, it's one of the hardest things to do with parents, is to say, hey, you shouldn't be driving. So how were we going to get her to that desired state? And so one of the things that we knew about her is that she loved her grandchildren and she never had enough time with them. And so because her grandchildren were older, in their 20s, what we did was arrange for each one of them to have different days that they would go and be with her and take her grocery shopping or to her doctor's appointments or whatever. And that created desire for her because she had more desire to see her grandchildren than she did of driving. And so that's an example of how you get somebody to desire. And this is on an individual basis. So desire usually is the manager that's managing the people because you know your people, right? You know what's happening with them. And you have to move people to desire, and you actually have to test if they're there. Again, that's usually with a survey. Okay, so let's say that we got the organization in awareness and desire. We're going to move to knowledge. And so knowledge is not training. Knowledge is like if you take the game of golf, it's how do you keep score? That's knowledge, right? And then action is how do you play? So one is I want to know about this new process. The other is I'm going to actually be trained in how to do the process. So there's knowledge and action is the place that you would be doing the training. And then there's reinforcement. So reinforcement is you celebrate, you give additional training, you're doing additional, awareness campaigns, and it's kind of circular. So you go right back to awareness, desire, knowledge, action, reinforcement, right? So reinforcement is the area that you would get shadow IT if you don't reinforce the actions. So this is the Prosci model, the model that you'll hear the most of in the industry. If you wanted to get a certification or go for extra training, Prosci is the place that I would recommend. So I'm going to stop there and see if there's any questions. I don't see any. Okay, so I'll just go on. Again, please go ahead and ask any questions that you have. So success factors and change. How do you, what is the advantages of effective communication and what does the success factors look like? So, well, awareness. So a clear and well thought out communication during the change management process minimizes the fears and doubts of employees. There's nothing scarier than not knowing, right? And you're like, I have no idea what's going on, but I know that there's changes happening. So awareness and having effective communication helps minimize fears and doubts from employees. They also have a better understanding of why it's happening, what is happening, when it's happening, how it's happening. So that understanding is so important. I know if you have little kids, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Kind of thing. And that's what you'll get a lot of from employees when they don't understand. They will ask a lot of questions and the same questions over and over. And then there's acceptance, right? So we gain acceptance when we have awareness and an understanding. And then there's commitment. So employees will then commit to it. Doesn't mean that they totally are bought in, but if they can get to acceptance, then they can be committed to the process, the new process change, which is really helpful. Just trying to move my PowerPoint forward here. So here are some of the ways that you can have communication channels. One of the things that I think is most important is how we're communicating throughout the entire process of change. So you can do presentations, you can have focus groups, you can have panel discussions, you can create an infographic, you can go on the road. Well, probably not in the pandemic, but usually you can. You can have question and answer sessions, videos, webcast, workshops, intranet websites, and one-on-ones. And I'm working on a large change initiative with Jenny right now, who was on when we first came on with AFDO. And we are hitting almost every single one of these boxes. So we're doing presentations. We have panel discussions with the council. We created 4 infographic news sheets. We're not going on the road yet. But Jenny just did 4 videos. We have an intranet site that Eric's helping us with. And we've been doing one-on-ones. And so it's really kind of like checking the boxes. How are you communicating through your change? And this is the most critical part of change management. And here are all the different ways that you can implement those. And you have to try different things in order to do that. and be successful. So I love this quote that organizations can't communicate, can't change. And organizations that can't change is dead, right? And so if you cannot communicate the change, that means that you really can't do change, because that employees will not come along. And those are the companies like a Blockbuster or Kodak or any of those organizations that went under, primarily when they were looked at was around their change initiatives. Excuse me. So analysis tools, some of the things that you can do is a stakeholder analysis. So, excuse me. This is one of the things that, as a change management practitioner, you want to look at all of your stakeholders, their objectives, their interests, their attitude, right? So maybe a stakeholder is your employee. That could be a stakeholder. A stakeholder could be a customer. It could be an executive. It could be an industry partner. So what you want to do is create a grid, and you want to lay out all your stakeholders. And then you want to say to yourself, okay, what do I know about the stakeholders? What is their objectives or interests? So for example, I've kind of just put examples here, like customer provides money and resources, employees provides the technical know-how. What is their attitude towards the project? So you could have a yes, no, a positive, neutral, a positive, negative, however you want to gauge it. And then what is their influence? So if the executive has a lot of influence, you want to put it here. Or if they have minimal influence, you just want to know, where your stakeholder influence is and what their impact and power is. So how much power do they have in whatever transformation that you're doing? So these stakeholder analyses are really important. So first we create stakeholder analysis, and then we create those change communication channels, because you want to communicate very different to each one of those stakeholders. So this is a really good example of a stakeholder analysis and what's called a journey map. So we have an example of Maria, and what we do is we say, okay, for in the morning, this is what Maria would do, in the mid-morning, in the noon, in the afternoon, and you've kind of fill in this whole journey. And in the journey map, you don't do it for every single person, but you do it for your big stakeholder groups. So if we have employees as a stakeholder, we would do employees, and we would do a journey map for the employee. And so this is where we would get the pain points, and where we might possibly understand how to communicate or what their needs are or what's changing for them. So stakeholder analysis and then journey mapping are kind of the tools that you would use for that. So for tools, just to kind of go back over that, you have your communication grid, all the different ways that you can communicate, you have your stakeholder analysis, and you have journey mapping. You can find a lot of information on any one of those topics out on LinkedIn Learning, or even if you just did YouTube, but those are kind of some of the basic tools that you'll want when you're moving change. So here's another thing that's really exciting and that is becoming pretty common is using change agents. So this is something that you might want to think about as an organization. And so what is a change agent? A change agent is just a typical employee that is excited. They're usually the person that does the training. They're always the gung-ho, the cheerleader kind of person. And you actually bring them into the fold. And what they do is they support the change, and they start to help implement some of the change in the communication, and they'll reduce and prevent conflict and opposition. So it's much better to have staff level change agents. So for example, for the project Jenny and I are on, the Safer project, we'll have between 25 and 40 change agents. And we have a change agent community that we're developing so that we can share our learning and be able to go out and implement whatever the transformation is. And so using change agents is a fairly large strategy now in organizations. And like when I was working for the state of Colorado, the governor had wanted me to implement change through the state, and we identified about 100 change agents. And then they were self-formed, and they met, and they do great work across Colorado. So involving everyone, and I think this is really important, is in step one, it's like gain an understanding on an individual level. You want to make sure everybody understands what the change is. And again, I know that this sounds redundant, but it's really important. And then step two is really more at a group level. So step one, you start having your managers talk to their staff. And then step two is more group level. And step three is more on an organizational level, right? So there's steps in change that you want to follow. This is so that you don't run into the obstacles. So the last thing that I want to talk about is leadership. And I think we miss this a lot. And a lot of times leaders feel like, staff can just move through change and organizational change. And it's not true. It has to come from leadership down. They have to support change. And so as a leader, here are the 6 pieces that I think are important is to be active, like change yourself, right? You have to be active in change. Be responsible. Don't hide behind others. Take 100% of responsibility. Be really transparent. Like, let's say you thought that you were going to change one way and you had to change course because it didn't work out. It's okay. Be transparent about that. Be really clear. Remember the elephant in the rider, right? This is where the clarity comes in. Be flexible, because sometimes you're going to start the change and you may hear employee feedback or stakeholder feedback and go like, oh yeah, we hadn't even really thought about that. And so be flexible in the change model. Be a role model. So make sure that you're also actively involved in the change, and then be part of the process. So this is what I say to all leaders when I go in to do any kind of change, is that they themselves have to be part of the process. So kind of a final thing from Winston Churchill: to improve is to change, and to be perfect is to change often. So remember, as I said, is the more you change, the more you help people, the more dexterity they have to change. And the more of a learning organization you become, the easier it is to adapt to change, because learning is changing. So every time you learn something, you change, right? So just think about that. To improve is to change, and to be perfect is to change often. So we're on to discussion and questions. And Eric, I don't know if you can just open up mics or if they have to type in questions.
I think they have to type in questions.
Okay. So we'll wait for questions. We don't have any. Oh,
at the moment.
No. Will you get a copy of the slides? Yes. Will recording be available? Yes. I think those were answered already.
Let me ask a question, Jennifer. When you were just talking about leadership there, is it necessary for the leader to be the manager or the supervisor or the executive, or does leadership come from anywhere when it comes with change?
Leadership can come from anywhere, but I do think that the stakeholders, so the executives, have to support it, right? So they have to financially support change, because it does cost money to have organizational change management happening, whether it's communications, creating flyers, all of those. But leadership can come from anywhere. So for example, a lot of the projects that I work on, there's an executive sponsor group, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the highest level in the organization. They were deemed to be executive sponsors for this project. So that's where leadership can come from on a project level. I think organizational change is different than project change. Project change is usually where people start in change management, and then they get to the organizational, like from top down, how do we want to move to change? And so leadership can take a lot of different forms. That's a really good question. And I think it depends. And in your stakeholder analysis, what you want to really do is identify who the leaders are, right? Because we want to hear from them. We want to hear that they're supporting it. But change, like the specific change. So let's say, Jenny, I was managing you. I was your direct manager. You're going to take change information better from me than you will someone else, because you know me and I know you and we have a relationship. So change kind of starts from the top and moves down the ladder. It's a good question. What are some of the other questions, or even projects that you're working on now that you're either using change management and maybe didn't know it, right? Because if you look at some of these things, I think that we kind of walk through change, even if we're not intentionally doing it, right? So we would communicate something saying, hey, we have this. And so any examples of that or questions on that? Oh, we have
Looks like you got a couple of questions in there, Jennifer.
a couple questions. Suggestions for balancing too much information so people lose interest in too little. I love that. This is really hard, right? Like change fatigue and communication fatigue. It's a balancing act. And Jenny and I talk about this all the time on our project, because are we giving too much information? People aren't opening it. We gauge that. I think it depends on your group and how much other information they're getting. So one of the things that's pretty common in the industry to think about is change fatigue. And how much information and how much change people are going through, because maybe on your project, that's just one of 20 things that are happening to that same individual, right? They might have to move their office. They might have to change 3 processes. Maybe they have a new software that's being implemented. And so I think as an organization, what's important to understand is how much change people are going through, how much information are we trying to give people. And it's a balancing act. I'm not sure anybody's figured out at all. I think that you have to look from project to project. And even today, when we had this scheduled, there was other webinars scheduled. So we had conflict of being able to give this information out. And so it's an amazing balancing act. And if you figure it out, let me know, because I would love to be able to have a gauge on that. We do have something called the AdCar analyzer that I use, and we can analyze how much awareness is going out and where people are and the desire. So there's some models that you can create, but I think that's still not super mature yet. And it's a great question to ask. So I don't have a really solid answer. I just know that we're always looking at the change fatigue and too much information. So Julie asked, 2020 was a year of constant change. Do you have any success stories of change in an organization that you can share? Yeah, I mean, like I said, I worked for the governor's office, and I was leading information technology last year when the pandemic started. I've moved on since then, but I think one of the biggest success stories that I was part of is moving the state employees to a remote work environment, primarily because most of them had never been allowed to work remote. We didn't even have VPN set up. It was kind of an old school way of thinking, right? It was like, no, you all have to be in the office. And then all of a sudden we were remote. And the productivity actually went up. So we started measuring people's productivity. Productivity skyrocketed working at home, even though it was super stressful. I think that was a successful change. Now, I do think that the pendulum can swing the other way as well. In that is that people are feeling isolated, not connected, right? So there's also these things that we have to look at when we have change success. So that would be one of the success stories. I've been in a lot of change situations, and I think the pandemic is just one that is amazing to look at. There's some universities, like the university that I go to, that I think has done a fairly good job, and then there's some that haven't in this change, right? So we can all see this. Even restaurants, here's a great example. I wasn't involved in this, but I love the story of it, and I started following them. There's it's a really high-end restaurant in Boulder, which is probably why I've never been. It's called the Black Cat. And they were all like farm to table, really super high-end. It was hard to get reservations. And when the pandemic happened, well, they couldn't even do to-go stuff. But what they did is they had this huge farm, is they had this old truck. It was this huge like bread delivery truck, and they painted it and they called it Mabel. And they started going from neighborhood to neighborhood, and you could actually ask them to come to your neighborhood. It was almost like a food truck, but you could like pre-order stuff, and they had all of their vegetables from their farm and all those. That ended up being so successful that they have 3 of those big trucks now, and Then on their farm, what they did is they built like these little pods. They like almost look like igloos, and they have like their own heating source in there. So you can actually go and have dinner there in your own like little igloo thing. I mean, I think they did an amazing job navigating, and they've changed their whole business model. They're like, should we ever actually go back to what we had? Because this seems to be much more agile. So I've seen a lot of really great change over the last year. And I'm sure everyone has. So another question is, all states implementing this new platform will need similar messaging to users. Should we start with similar templates? Will you provide? Yes, we're going to have templates for the new platform. So that if you're not aware, we have a new platform that's going to be developed called Safer. And we have a state preparation plan, and we have a change management plan, and we are going to be sharing all of that with everyone because we want you to be successful in change. And I think if you have a plan, you can absolutely implement change, even if you had a little help with a consulting organization. But if you implement like the change agents and you start having a plan, like that state preparation plan that we have, I think that you'll be able to do a lot of this on your own, and you can actually start today. Like if you think about any changes that are happening, you can start now. How would we implement a little change before the big change starts happening? So great question. And these slides will be shared out as well. And so what I wanted to also say is that if you're interested in learning more, I think we're going to have more live sessions, and this would only be based on your feedback. So if you felt like this was valuable, we'll send a survey out. I really want to dig deep into how do you actually implement AdCar? What is it that you do? What are the actions and the steps? That's a whole session. And then using some other tools. So we'll also have the John Cotter model, but we also will have tools like creating journey mapping. How do you create stakeholder engagement? Creating a readiness assessment plan. And so there's other things that we can be doing together. And I'd love it to be more like a workshop that you're actually, we can do breakout rooms and those things, but it's really going to depend on what you want. This is, AFTO's being very generous with my time and saying, go ahead and, spread the love of change management, because it's so important in everything that we do today. And I'll tell you this it's kind of a funny story. It's not super funny to my kids, but it's really kind of funny and change. About 9 years ago, our two sons, one was serving in AmeriCorps and the other was serving in the other division, FEMA Corps. So all of our kids have had to serve a year in it's like a Peace Corps. You probably know what it is. And we were living in Vermont. I owned a big consulting company. My husband owned a welding company. And I really felt like I wanted to do something kind of more meaningful. And this position came up as the CIO for the National MS Society. And I thought, I've never worked in large nonprofit. I really think that this is where we should be. And so our kids were gone. So one of our sons was in Montana. The other was in New Jersey. That's when Hurricane Sandy happened, right? So they're doing their volunteer work. And I fly out to Denver, I get the job offer, I decide I'm going to sell my business, and all of this happens in a short period of time. And we never tell our kids. I don't know why. I don't even know. I wasn't even thinking, right? When you have change and you're excited and you're like, yeah, everybody's going to be excited about this. And so I took a picture, and I usually have it in the PowerPoint deck. I didn't put it in this one, but I took a picture of our moving truck, and we had a motorcycle trailer, and we had my car, and right outside of our house, and I posted it on Facebook, and I just said, goodbye, Vermont, and hello, Colorado. And both of our sons saw that while they were gone, and their reaction was like, do we live in Vermont anymore? So that was the worst example of change management from a change management practitioner. And every year they remind me of that, because we didn't give them any heads up. They had no say in it. It wouldn't have changed our mind, but maybe a conversation would have been a good thing. So I always hearken back to that when I think, hey, I have this brilliant idea and everyone's going to love it. I'm like, well, maybe, right? Because maybe you love it and not everybody will love it. So moving them through change is important.
Right. Yeah, I don't see any additional questions, Jennifer, from the group. Maybe one last call out to everybody if you want to put something in the chat. or the Q&A, excuse me.
Okay. All right. Well, I don't see that. We will be reaching out to everyone and sending you the PowerPoint. And if you could be so kind as to send back any kind of feedback, we'll love to send you a survey. I know everybody has survey fatigue, but just let us know, was this helpful? Do you want more? What is it you're looking for? What kind of change are you going through? Do you need any help with that? As far as like templates or whatever, I have all kinds of things that I can share out with you if you're interested. And there's no charge to you or the state. We're doing this because we really want to have everybody be successful. So yeah, we'd love to hear from you. So without keeping you any longer, and there's no more questions, Jenny, I think, we're done. So
Good.
we'd love to hear from you. So thank
All
you
right.
very much for everybody logging in, and I appreciate your time.
All right, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you to all the participants who came in today, and we will be providing the slides and the recording, etc., as described. So have a good rest of your day, afternoon, morning, etc. Thank you.